Hello, Sam's fans. Welcome again to Facebook Live. Every Wednesdays, we have these interviews with music therapists, art therapists, and other folks. And we really enjoy having these interviews, and we enjoy when you also connect and watch and ask questions and comments. And today, we have Dr. Noah Potvin. Did I say that right, your last name?
You did.
Awesome. And I'm really excited about this interview. Dr. Noah Potvin, he's an assistant professor at Duquesne University, and he has expertise in music therapy and end-of-life care settings, so we'll be talking a lot about that. He got his bachelor's and master's at Temple University and his PhD at Drexel University. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to come on.
Definitely. So just to start, can you maybe tell us a bit about your background, how did you get into music therapy, and about also your education?
Sure. So I got into music by playing the flute at a very young age, and I had an aptitude for it. And so I found myself in various ensembles. And by the time I hit high school, I knew I wanted to do something with music, but I wasn't quite sure what. And I knew I didn't want to be a performer, and yet I didn't see any other real option. So I went to a conservatory doing performance on flute. And as I knew I was going to be, I was sufficiently miserable, and it was not what I wanted. And it wasn't until I got there that I realized that I didn't really love playing the flute because of the instrument itself, and I didn't really like performing. What attracted me to music was being in the groups, going to the rehearsals, being in the concerts, and not performing for the audience, but just feeling connected to my fellow musicians up on stage, feeling connected to the conductor. And then I went to a conservatory environment, which is very competitive. And all of a sudden we weren't working together as an ensemble. Everybody was auditioning against each other. And I felt very isolated in my music. And then just by a real stroke of luck, I was introduced to music therapy through a special education class that I took just on a whim because I didn't know what else to do. And it just happened to be taught by a music therapist who showed us some clinical examples from Nordhoff Robbins music therapy. And it was a light bulb over the head moment where I looked at it and said, yes, that's what I want to do. I don't want to be making music at people. I want to be making music with them. And so from there, I transferred to Temple. And like you said, I got my bachelor's and my master's there. And I started practicing in psychiatric hospitals before moving on to doing hospice work. And that led me to wanting to pursue my doctorate. So I got that at Drexel. And I spent a year teaching at University of Dayton. And now I'm at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the United States, and just finished up my second year there.
Awesome. So University of Dayton, we actually, we've had somebody, Dr. James Hiller, is he at University of Dayton? Yeah, we had him.
Yeah.
And we found a music therapist over at Dayton Children's Hospital. So that's awesome. I didn't know that.
Great. Was that Lindsay Steinbrenner?
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Did you study with her or?
No, we co-taught actually. We ran we ran one class together. So it's been a while since I've seen Lindsay, but she does really good work.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love all these connections. It looks like everybody knows everybody.
Oh, it's a small world.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, for me personally, one of the things that really interests me about your work is that you talk about spiritual issues, and it's a lot of this in the area of end-of-life care, but I'm just interested how you came to be interested in end-of-life care and spirituality.
Yeah. So my interest in end-of-life care began unknowingly when I was 17 years old, and my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer at the time. And she has thankfully been in remission for a while now. But at the time I was 17 and I didn't know how to be supportive. I was kind of lost in my own world at the time. I was doing college auditions and I was hanging out with friends, and I knew that my mom was going through this, but I didn't know how to be present for her, or really, in truth, to be present for myself through it. And so then after this sort of long route that I just described, getting to music therapy, I became really interested in understanding how can I support caregivers. And as I've gotten deeper into the end-of-life care work, I have found that the paradox of music therapy in end-of-life care is that 50% of the time, only really 50% of the time, are we there for the actual patient. That many times people who are dying, they are at a place of acceptance or peace with it. They may not be happy with it, but they're not fighting it. They benefit from support, but they don't need the support. And that's in contrast to the other 50% of the time where it's the caregivers who are really the ones who benefit most from sitting down and processing their feelings, having a space to explore what's going on for them, because they are not yet in that place of resolution. Because, and I think this is in large part influenced because our culture around death in the United States is a very unhealthy one. Mm-hmm. We frame death as a battle that has been lost. I mean, we hear that all the time with cancer. And I think I became sensitive to this when my mother was going through this, is when people die from cancer, like even the word die, we don't use it. What do we say? People lost their battle with cancer. Well, what do we think of people who lose battles? We think of them as weaker. We have all these narratives around them. And it's interesting to me that we do that with cancer, because then what does that suggest? What's the implicit suggestion of people who go into remission or become cancer-free? Do they win their battle? Are they stronger? Do they want to live more than the other person? Now, we don't say that explicitly, but that's what's communicated underneath the surface. And I think caregivers, they're very prone to those. They're very prone to those narratives, and it comes out in ways that they may not even be aware of. So I can't tell you how many times I've sat with very loving children with their elderly parents who are in their 70s, 80s, 90s with dementia, and they'll go, "Oh, Mom," they'll try to prop their parent up, like, "Mom, no, you can do this, and they put a shaker in their hand and they try to make them play the instrument, and it comes from a place of love, it comes from a place of caring, but it also comes from a place of fear that if their mom or dad dies on their watch, that somehow they have failed them, because death is a failure at the end of the day. So I became really interested in working with caregivers in that capacity. And so then as I started to dive deeper into the literature and I started to dive deeper into my own practices with it, I found that spirituality was something that it was a vehicle, it was a medium that really helped them alongside the music, that the music became almost an access point to engaging with some faith-based teaching or some spiritual practice or some sort of ritual that helped to give them grounding, that helped to provide focus, that helped to provide some sense of peace. But then as I began diving deeper into it, I found myself similarly at a loss as to understanding what is actually happening here. What is it about spirituality? What is it about faith? What is it about these practices, these rituals, these teachings that are providing them, that's providing them a sense of closure and resolution right now? And then to take it a step further, what is it about music therapy practice that enables this? How are spirituality and music marrying in this moment? And then how do we then distinguish what we're doing as music therapists from what the chaplains are doing? Because many chaplains, they have beautiful voices and they play instruments themselves. Mm-hmm. So I became really, so that became my access point for really diving deeper into this exploration.
Yeah, definitely. And one of my introduction to your work was the paper from 2014 called Theoretical Considerations of Spirit and Spirituality in Music Therapy. And this is really not something that at Sam's Fans we've talked a lot about. We have this blog and these interviews that we do, but we haven't really delved too much into these topics, which I also believe are important. So what do you think is the importance of talking and addressing these issues, especially, for example, our supporters who might not know much about music therapy, but they know that we support music therapists at children's hospitals, that, they're helping kids who are maybe not so severely ill, all the way to children in palliative care and end-of-life care. So what do you think is the importance of addressing these issues?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of layers to it. I think the first is just the pragmatic consideration that the vast majority of people identify as believing in or feeling connected to something other than or more than the corporeal or the mortal. Now, what's really interesting about that is how the landscape is changing, at least in the United States. Just about I think it was about 4 or 5 weeks ago, there was a headline that came out from some census data that had been tracked. And for the first time, a majority of Americans have responded to this poll identifying themselves as non-religious instead of being Catholic, whereas Catholic has been the majority for so long now. And so, and there's been a lot of data points over the past 10 to 15 years that have been showing this trend and the shift. Now, what's important here is non-religious to notice that non-religious doesn't mean non-belief. It just means that I don't align myself with an organized religion right now. And so there is a strong sense of connectivity to the other than, to the ineffable. And if we're thinking about being a person-centered practice, then we need to really be able to meet people in those spaces. And so particularly in end-of-life care, that becomes important because you have people who are now looking to transcend. They're moving into a transition. Something, it's not just their physical body that's dying, but it's their way of life. Especially so if you think about it again for caregivers, they are moving on into another phase in their relationship with this individual. They're going to become a widow or a widower. They're going to become bereaved in some kind. And their way of relating to themselves and their everyday is going to change. Especially, so I mentioned dementia before. I think about this in particular with the caregivers who have been taking loving care of their family member or their friend for 5, 7, 10 years with dementia, and their day-to-day has been consumed in some way by making sure that all of their needs are being met, and now this person isn't there. So this old way of life has died, and now this new way of living has been given birth to. So there's these really significant transitions. So there's a transcendence that happens both for the person whose physical body is dying, but there's also a transcendence for the people whose way of life, previous way of life has died and is being reborn into something else. So the need is there just on an objective level. And then specific to music therapy, music has very deep roots and rituals and practices born from communing with the divine. So I look at even contemporary music that's been framed as secular, it draws from those rich traditions. So for instance, I'm fascinated by electronic dance music and heavy metal concerts because these are really great music events that it's not just about the sound. It's not about the performer up there playing the guitar or singing or hitting the drum or playing the bass or using whatever instruments that they're using. It's about the type of community that's being developed. It's about how is the audience dancing in response, like the functions of a mosh pit, or the functions of a huge festival outdoors, and the functions of a call and response, or of the band cutting out and letting the audience come in and bring their voices into the chorus. That is it's a flow that happens among all these gathered stakeholders. And that's not random. That comes from these very deep and rich traditions of using music in these ritualized ways to commune with the divine.
Right.
And then third, spiritual health is really important. To me, it's just as important as the other domains of health, like emotional or physical or physiological or social. And so it behooves music therapists to be responsive to the historical intertwining of music and spirituality in the pursuit of health outcomes.
Yeah, for sure. And so I love this question, and I'm not going to take credit for it. From your paper, do the spiritual functions of both music and music therapy need to be explicit in order for them to be impactful, or are they so embodied that to engage in either is to be spiritual? So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on this. So in other words, is music and music therapy inherently prone to drive these kind of processes, or does it need to be addressed explicitly, I guess, in a session?
Yeah, again, I think it's a complex answer. I do believe that to be musical is to be spiritual, and I do believe that to be spiritual is to be musical. Because, and I think there's a lot of overlaps there. For one, they're both very malleable mediums. And by mediums, I mean, this comes from, I take this from Ken Egan's work, where he makes the distinction between a mean and a medium. And a mean is a tool. We use it to get some sort of direct, predictable outcome. A medium, however, is an experience. It's something that we're sitting in, and we don't necessarily know where it's going. We don't necessarily know what it's going to become from one moment to the next. And it's going to be something very emergent. And spirituality and music are both of those things. I could sing Amazing Grace, and I have sung Amazing Grace, dozens of times over the course of the week, but it manifests differently depending upon the space that I'm in, what's happening to me physically, what the needs are of the people that I'm working with. And so it's never fully 100% replicated. It's always a new remix of sorts. And I believe that prayer and worship and any sort of religious practice is very similar. So I do believe that they're very embodied. However, do they need to be explicitly known? I think this is where it gets complex. Mm-hmm. I think for patients, they don't necessarily need to be explicitly aware of it. So the analogy I always think of is, if I go to a physical therapist because I have some sort of strains, let's say hamstring, they're going to give me a whole number of exercises to do. And what am I going to do? I'm going to do the exercises. I don't need to know what exactly those exercises are going to do to help soothe my strained hamstring. I'm just going to trust the professional and I'm going to go do it. And probably my muscle is going to start feeling better. So I don't really need to know the mechanism. And I think that can be the same for patients who are engaging with music and spirituality in this fluid way. They don't need to necessarily know what the functions are in order to derive the benefits from it. However, I do think that makes it incumbent on the interventionist or the music therapist to know what those mechanisms are, so the clinical decision-making is both practice-based and evidence-based. And so this is where it gets tricky for us. And this is really where I feel like we need to make a really big shift in terms of how we talk about spirituality and music therapy, is that because it's incumbent upon us to know what those mechanisms are, we have to be really careful to not make assumptions as to what those spiritual functions may or may not be in response to any given music experience or type of treatment situation. So part of what makes music therapy such a difficult yet rich field is that each music therapist brings with them their own sets of relationships with music, their own expectations about what music is capable of doing, and their own understandings of the role of music in any given situation. It's really fertile soil for us to tend. But at the same time, we have to be exceedingly careful not to project our relationships, our expectations, our understandings onto our patients. When we do, we rob them of the agency that they need to become actualized, integrated beings, both in therapy and in life on a more general level. And the ability and opportunity to approach a situation and decide for ourselves what we wish to take from it is something that's fundamental to who we are as people. So what music therapists are then tasked with is facilitating therapeutic structures that embrace the spiritual qualities of music and the musical qualities of the spiritual, so that patients are empowered in making explicit, both for themselves and the music therapist, what spiritual framework they are drawing from. In other words, we have to be very culturally responsive. We can't just say spirituality and just have that be okay. Spirituality is this really broad term. I think of it in terms of an umbrella. An umbrella opens up. It's meant to capture all these little water droplets, but then all the water droplets, they disperse and they go everywhere and they fall to the ground and we lose them. And that's kind of what spirituality does to a certain extent. It opens up and we're meant to try to capture all these different beliefs and all these different practices, but there's nothing to hold on to it. There's nothing capturing all of it. And if we fall into the trap of just saying, oh, somebody is spiritual, well, then what we're doing is we're opening up a doorway for us to go in and say, this is what spirituality must mean for them because it means that for me. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to, in fact, move away from even using the word spiritual to the extent that we can and start to focus much more specifically on beliefs, much more specifically on concrete practices, much more specifically on doctrines or philosophies or teachings that people are taking with them. So that then we can be very, very specific in terms of, not prescriptive, but very specific in terms of the interventions that we're designing. Because only then are we really meeting them meeting them where they're at, instead of asking them to meet us where we are currently. Yeah,
totally. And it also seems to me that all these issues of spirituality, as important as you mentioned that they also don't seem to be addressed as much by music therapists, at least to my knowledge. I know that people like David Aldrich has written extensively about spirituality, but I'm just wondering too, if you've seen any kind of friction with your work in terms of music therapy really trying to be, like you said, evidence-based and as scientific as possible. So I feel that sometimes in the Western world, in this science realm, we cringe when we hear spirituality and these other things. So I don't know what has been your experience in that?
Yeah. So I have to say that I came into looking at spirituality. I did my thesis on looking at whether spiritual belief predicted theoretical orientation in music therapists. And that was in 2008, 2009, somewhere around there. Mm-hmm. By that point, spirituality was become something that people are very interested in. My understanding is that historically, like in the 90s, when David Aldrich really started to make this push, that spirituality was something very taboo. My understanding of literature, of research in the 90s was that we wanted to become more cognitive behavioral. We wanted to show that we could get very concrete outcomes based on very specific interventions, which is important for sure. But in the process of leaning so heavily in that direction, these more amorphous ideas like spirituality became something taboo in which to talk about. So I look to David's work a lot, and I'm very thankful for it because it has provided us such a beautiful foundation. And yet, I will say this, is I think that we need to move beyond where David has started us from, and we need to get more specific. I have experiences with my students where I'll read passages, and I'll say this too. My own. So you referenced that 2014 article about theoretical considerations of spirit and spirituality. I feel like I fell into the same issue, where my co-author and I, Jillian, argue. We talked about spirituality in these really big and really amorphous ways. And I'll share passages of that paper with my students and like a paragraph, and I'll ask them, are you able to take what I just wrote or what I wrote here and apply it into your practice tomorrow? And almost across the board, they'll say no. And it's because it's too loose, it's too open-ended. And I can't even do it for myself. Being 5 years removed from the paper now, it's I think it introduces concepts that are of interest, but whether it has clinical relevance, I think is a really big and open question, which is why. And so to answer your question, how do we, what's this next step here? I think the next step is to move away from spirituality, because I actually want spirituality to become taboo again, because I don't want it to be this catch-all. I think we need to challenge ourselves when we sit with a patient who is Christian to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be Christian and dying? What faith-based teachings are they bringing with them to provide comfort before they transcend, before they move on to heaven? What faith-based teachings are their caregivers taking with them to help them to move into this new role in their life? We need to do that with people of all different faiths, of all different denominations, of all different levels or degrees or variations of those denominations. And that's what this most recent paper that I published, I can't remember if it was this year or last year. I think it was this year. And this is what we got to. We looked at how can we understand the Holy Spirit as a resource for Christian patients at the end of life? So let me be clear. This is not, we don't mean this to be presumptuous. We're not saying that, the Holy Spirit is absolutely a resource that every Christian patient is always going to turn to when they're dying. In fact, we readily acknowledge that there's a Trinity that's in place, and that and Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit could at any point be that resource that people turn to. If somebody's Catholic, they might be turning towards a saint. So it's not meant to be prescriptive, but it's more meant to be almost like a thought exercise, like a philosophical argument as to how can we begin to look at specific faith-based tenets and practices and teachings and rituals to better understand specifically the mechanism of how spirituality or how religion is helping somebody to prepare at the end of life. Yeah. And I really feel like that has to be the next step, is to do a deep dive, not only into the music therapy and psychology literature, but to do deep dives into theology, into scripture, into verbal traditions that are passed down within religions as well, so that we can understand what are these lived, and you mentioned the word embodied, what are these embodied experiences that people take with them as they begin to prepare to go into whatever their post-life construct might be. And then what is the role of music therapy in helping to facilitate those rituals within our scope of practice? And I think that's the trick, is how do we have this conversation about superimposing, I'm just going to go with Christianity since that's what I've been studying. How do we go move ahead with superimposing Christian beliefs and practices on top of music therapy practice, but without venturing too far into the chaplain's lane and venturing outside of our scope of practice? I believe it's possible. And in fact, I believe we have an ethical obligation to move in that direction, to do that, not as a way of proselytizing or preaching to patients, but to really meet them where they're at in that moment, to at a point of urgent need, to provide a resource that's going to be of great benefit to them. And I think we have to challenge ourselves to consider, how can we expand our practice in this way?
Yeah, definitely. And I love that. And it also sounds like it's a huge undertaking. And it also makes me think that maybe it's not a task for 1 or 5 or 10 music therapists. It's for, there's really needs to be a lot of work in this area to get as detailed and as specific as you were saying.
Absolutely. So fully. And, and that's actually something that my co-author and I, Kathleen Flynn, we put that at the end of the paper. We said, we hope that a trajectory of research develops that directly challenges what we're doing right here, because we need to be in a position where we have a very robust discourse about this. And so to your point, is part of what I had to do. This article was very, very long in the making, and I spent a lot of hours talking with priests and theology professors, and even before I submitted the paper, I sent it out to a number of these consultants, and essentially they were consultants, and said, "Am I getting this right? Because I'm Jewish. I'm not even Christian. And so I'm coming in this from a very academic perspective, not a lived perspective at all. And I wanted to make sure that we were really getting this right. And moving forward, I think it will absolutely take and require a very diverse team of researchers and clinicians and theologians and chaplains working together to develop these philosophical frameworks.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I would love to. I think this is a topic that we could spend a long time talking about. But I'm also wanting and wondering if, for these last 5 minutes, if you have a story you could share with us from your clinical work, maybe from something you've seen in terms of end-of-life care and spirituality.
The vignette that comes to mind is one that we wrote, that we typed out in this most recent article about music therapy being a psycho-spiritual ministry of response during imminent death. And it was really a clinical experience that really got this line of thinking going for me. And the woman's name was Jeanette, and she was in her 80s. And I had a couple of sessions with her, and she lived with her husband. And now she was at a point where she was actively dying. So actively dying is this phase. It's like a 24 to 72 hour window in which there's a whole host of symptoms that we see that indicate that they've moved into a place of active preparation for death. So their breathing will become altered, their alertness and their awareness of their surroundings, their eyes might be fixed. There's all sorts of signs that we see. And she was very clearly in this phase of transition. So I was called in to please come make a visit, which is very common for music therapists because music can provide a lot of relief on some level. It can provide a lot of different multi-level support. So I walk in and she's in the hospital bed and she's been moved into the living room, into this communal space. So this is already really interesting for me as somebody who's Jewish because in my tradition, with my family, death was something that you did not really honor. It's something that you fought against, and people died in private. They didn't die in these communal spaces. And when somebody was dying, it's like you didn't talk about it. You would serve food and you would tell jokes and you would share stories, but you wouldn't actually talk about what was happening. And so I walk in and here's this woman surrounded by her family as she's laying in a hospital bed, actively dying. So the husband I talked with the husband. He invites me to come sit bedside and I asked him what sort of music he would like to offer his wife right now. And he requested a number of different hymns. And this is where it got really interesting for me. So I started introducing these hymns, and these various pockets of family members all of a sudden started to convene around the hospital bed. They weren't satellites anymore. Now they were a part of the experience. They were being drawn in. And I don't think it was me drawing them in. The music was playing a very specific religious-based role in that moment, because then what happened is they all took hands and we all stood up, and I stood there with them. And one by one, they all offered testimony about Jeanette. They offered prayers, they offered stories. Testimony is really the best word I can think of for it. And it got to me, and I didn't know what else to do except to sing another hymn and offer that as testimony for Jeanette. And it struck me that what was happening right now was there was something horizontal and going on, and also something vertical. So vertical meaning that Jeanette was leaving this realm. She wasn't going to be long for this world. And from all our work prior, I knew that she was awaiting her return to God. She was it's what they call a home sending. She wanted to go to heaven. She was ready for it. So we were helping to lift her up in that moment. That's where she wanted to go. We were helping to give her permission. And from my own perspective, I think we were helping provide her access to the Holy Spirit to help move her in that direction. But then there was also horizontal energy where all the caregivers, and we're all holding hands. And what we were doing was connecting with each other. We were letting go of Jeanette as she was upwardly moving, and we were connecting with each other in this horizontal way, because this is who was going to be left here. This was who was going to be left behind, so to speak. And I walked out, and I wasn't thinking in this way. I kind of had like a sense of these ineffable qualities of the session, but I didn't have any sort of framework for it until at the very end. And the husband, he said, "Thank you for your ministry." And it just blew my mind, because I never thought at first I thought I had overstepped my role, because when I think ministry, I think priest, I think reverend, I think somebody coming and teaching religion. And that really caused me to take a step back and really critically ask myself, what does it actually mean to be a minister? outside of my Jewish perspective, what does it mean when people say ministry? And that's when I came into this understanding, as taught to me by others, that ministry is to be in service to. So it didn't even really have to do with teaching. It had to be, am I providing a service to? And if I'm providing a service, then the music must be providing a service. And I will forever be grateful for Jeanette and her family, because not only was it just a beautiful experience, but it also helped open my eyes to what I feel is a really inviting and important frontier for music therapists to continue walking down.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for that story. I remember reading it in the paper. If anybody's interested in Dr. Noah Potvin's work, it's out there. Check it out. It's a lot of really interesting stuff. And we're nearing the end, so I'm just wondering if anybody watching has a comment or a question. This is your last chance. But yeah, any parting words, anything else that you would like to say before we finish here?
No, other than just that, like I said before, I openly invite for us to have these conversations. I by no means see myself, or truly anybody, as a guru or an expert on this topic. I think we all have a responsibility to be interacting with each other and to be challenging each other in constructive ways, to be considering just what is the next step, and always in service to the patient. Always in service to how can we possibly provide the best practices for this person, so that in the very limited time that we have together, we can help them to die in a way that's going to be meaningful and resolved from their worldview. Yeah,
definitely. Well, thank you so much again for joining. And thank you for anybody watching. We're having Facebook Live next week. I'm not sure who we're having yet, but tune in 3 p.m. on Wednesdays every week. We have Facebook Live broadcast. And again, thank you so much, Sam's fans, for watching, for supporting our mission. And thank you, Dr. Potvin.
Thank you.
Okay.